Careful, she bites. The laughter hit before anyone even saw her move. 340 Marines. One training mat. And a sergeant major pointing at the smallest person in the formation, like she was the punchline to a joke he'd been telling for months. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She just looked at him with the kind of quiet that made the men nearest to her suddenly stop laughing. Not because she said anything, but because something in her eyes told them the joke was already over. They just didn't know it yet. If this story already has you leaning forward, stay with me. Subscribe to the channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning started the way most mornings at Camp Pendleton started, with men who were certain they already knew everything important about the people standing next to them. It was a Thursday. The sky was the flat gray of early California winter, and the combat training field smelled like damp earth and canvas. 340 Marines had been assembled into a loose formation around the main demonstration mat, the kind of crowd that arranges itself by rank and comfort without anyone saying a word. The senior NCOs stood near the center. The junior enlisted filled out the edges. Everyone had coffee. Nobody was fully awake. That was fine. The demonstration wasn't supposed to be complicated. Sergeant Major Ryan Whitaker had run this particular training block 17 times over the past 3 years. He knew the rhythm of it. He knew exactly how to hold a crowd's attention, how to use a moment of controlled force to drive home a lesson, and how to make sure that when 340 men walked off that field, they remembered exactly one thing. Size and aggression were not decorative, they were decisive. Howe was good at what he did. That was not in question. At 6 feet 4 inches and 230 pounds. Whitaker moved with the particular confidence of a man who had never been in a fight. He didn't finish. 18 years, 3 combat deployments, an instructor's certificate that took most men twice as long to earn. His record was clean, his reputation was solid, and the Marines who trained under him tended to become the kind of operators who didn't freeze when things went wrong. He had already put 3 younger Marines on the ground that morning, a corporal, a staff sergeant, and a lance corporal, who'd made the mistake of thinking he could use speed to compensate for positioning. All 3 had been handled efficiently, cleanly, without humiliation. Whitaker wasn't cruel. He was instructive. There was a difference. But then he turned toward the formation, and his eyes moved across the crowd in that slow, deliberate way he had: scanning, categorizing, selecting. And they stopped. Lieutenant Claire Morgan was standing near the back of the formation, slightly to the left of the second row, in the particular way of someone who had learned that the edge of a crowd was the safest place to observe without being observed. She was in standard training gear. No distinguishing marks visible. No rank insignia that would have meant anything to someone who wasn't paying attention. She was 28 years old, 5 feet 5 inches, 132 pounds on a heavy day. She had dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, eyes that were the kind of steady brown that didn't give anything away, and an expression that could best be described as absolutely nothing. Not boredom, not anxiety, not the performed neutrality of someone trying to hide something. Just stillness. She had been attached to the Marine Training Division for 6 months. Officially, her assignment was Joint Operational Evaluation, a SEAL liaison role that involved observing training protocols, documenting readiness benchmarks, and filing reports that would go up the chain on the Navy side of the house. It was administrative in its formal description and almost entirely invisible in practice. She sat in briefings, she watched exercises, she filed her reports, she didn't ask to be featured, she didn't ask for anything. Most of the Marines in the formation barely knew her name. The ones who did know her name knew it mostly through the filter of Ryan Whitaker's commentary, which had been a consistent background noise for the entire 6 months she'd been on base. It wasn't malicious in the way that malice usually looks. It was casual, familiar, the kind of dismissal that doesn't feel like dismissal because it comes wrapped in humor. Careful around Lieutenant Morgan. She might bite. Someone remind me to get her a rifle that isn't heavier than she is. Hope she's not planning to carry her own gear today. Nobody ever told him to stop. Not because everyone agreed with him. But because disagreeing with a sergeant major, who was also the best combatives instructor on the base, was a calculation, most people weren't willing to make over something they had collectively decided didn't matter that much. Claire Morgan had heard every word of it. She had chosen every single time to say nothing. Ryan Whitaker saw her at the back of the formation and walked toward her. He didn't do it quickly. He took his time. He let the crowd notice where he was going, let the energy shift, let the anticipation build the way it does when 340 people all realize simultaneously that something is about to happen. He stopped about 10 feet from the mat and pointed directly at her. "Lieutenant Morgan." She looked at him. "Come show everyone what you can do." There was a beat of silence, the brief suspended kind that comes right before a room decides how to react, and then the laughter started. Not mean laughter exactly. Not the vicious kind. The comfortable kind. The kind that belongs to people who think they already know how the story ends and are enjoying the familiarity of being right. Someone near the middle of the formation, a staff sergeant named Hodges, who had been on base for 8 years and who considered himself a reasonable man, shouted it. "Careful, she bites." The formation broke. 340 Marines laughed. Not at her, most of them would have said later if pressed. Just at the situation. At the absurdity of a 5'5" Navy liaison being called up to demonstrate against Whitaker. It wasn't personal. It was just funny. Claire Morgan looked at Ryan Whitaker for a moment. Then she walked to the mat. Nobody stopped laughing right away. The laughter tapered slowly the way laughter does. When the thing that made it funny is still happening, but the energy underneath it has shifted almost imperceptibly in a direction nobody can quite name. She stopped at the edge of the mat. Whitaker was already on it. He smiled at her, not unkindly, but with the particular warmth of someone who has already decided he's doing her a favor by giving her this moment. "You sure about this, Lieutenant?" Claire looked at him steadily. "Yes, Master Sergeant." The title was correct. The tone was neutral. There was nothing sharp in it, nothing aggressive, nothing that could be called a provocation. But several of the Marines closest to the mat would later say that something changed in the atmosphere right then, something they couldn't quite explain. The way a room temperature drops by 2 degrees and everyone feels it without anyone saying anything. "I don't go easy," Whitaker told her. "Not for the demonstration. You understand. I didn't ask you to." Sergeant First Class Daniel Brooks, who was standing approximately 8 feet from the mat, and who had been a competitive grappler for 11 years before he found the Marine Corps, stopped smiling at that exact sentence. He would not be able to explain later why those 4 words unsettled him, but they did. He looked at the woman on the mat more carefully than he had before. She wasn't in a fighting stance. She was standing the way someone stands when they're waiting for a bus, upright, balanced, hands loose at her sides. But there was something in the quality of her stillness that Brooks recognized from years of training, the particular kind of relaxation that isn't absence of readiness, but is readiness so complete it has nowhere left to go except stillness. He thought, "She's been here before." The thought was gone almost as quickly as it came, because Whitaker was already moving. His first approach was controlled, a measured advance designed to close distance and establish physical dominance. The kind of move that tells someone immediately whether they're dealing with someone who knows what space means or someone who doesn't. Almost everyone who wasn't trained would have either backed up or held their ground wrong. Claire moved, not back, not into him. Diagonally, a single step precisely timed that put her at a 45-degree angle to his advance and made his momentum carry him slightly past where she'd been standing. It happened fast. Most of the formation didn't catch it, but the ones who did went quiet. Whitaker reset. His expression hadn't changed. He wasn't rattled. He was a professional, and professionals don't rattle in a single exchange. He circled. She tracked him without moving her feet, just turning from the hips, weight distributed in a way that Brooks recognized from his grappling days as something that took years to make automatic. Brooks leaned toward the Marine beside him, a sergeant named Gutierrez, and said quietly, "Watch her feet." Gutierrez watched her feet for 3 seconds and then said equally quietly, "What the hell?" Whitaker attacked again. This time with more commitment, a direct forward pressure combined with a left arm reach that was designed to grab and control. It was fast. It was powerful. Against 99% of the people he would ever use it on, it would have worked. Claire pivoted. It wasn't a dodge. It was something more precise than a dodge. A rotation that used the inside of his forearm as a redirecting surface. Her shoulder dropping slightly. Her weight, transferring his own force, continuing forward, and slightly down, in a direction he hadn't intended. The whole thing took less than a second, and looked almost gentle. Whitaker didn't fall. He recovered. He was good enough for that. But the recovery cost him. It opened his left side, and for a fraction of a second, his weight was wrong, and Claire simply wasn't where he expected her to be. The formation had gone silent. Not completely silent. There were still the ambient sounds of 340 people breathing, shifting their weight, clearing their throats. But the laughter was gone. Entirely. As if someone had reached into the air and removed it. Brooks said under his breath to no one in particular, "She's reading him." It was true. And it was the thing that none of the Marines who had laughed earlier had been prepared for, not the physical capability, which was surprising enough, but the intelligence behind it. The patience. Claire Morgan wasn't reacting to what Whitaker was doing. She was anticipating it. Every time he committed to a direction, she had already moved. Every time he tried to establish control of the engagement somehow wasn't where he'd put it. Whitaker was frustrated now. Not enraged. He had too much experience for rage, but the particular frustration of a man whose model of the situation has stopped matching the situation. He'd expected to make a point. He was still making one, just not the one he'd planned. He changed tactics. Instead of trying to control the technical exchange, he went physical, a full-force forward rush with a double-leg takedown attempt, the kind of move that relies on weight and drive and commitment over technique, because against a significant size disadvantage, those things matter. The formation leaned forward almost as one body. Everyone knew what was coming. They were wrong. Claire's left foot planted. Her hip dropped not away from him, toward him, lower than he expected, meeting his angle of attack instead of fleeing it. Her right arm came around. His momentum, rather than driving through her, redirected a physics problem resolving itself in the only direction it had left to go. 230 pounds of Marine Raider instructor hit the mat. The sound was clean and definite. And then there was nothing. No noise from the formation. No comment. No shuffling. Nothing. 340 Marines stood completely still. Claire stepped back. Exactly one step. She wasn't breathing hard. Her expression hadn't changed. It was the same neutral stillness that it had been at the back of the formation 20 minutes ago, when she was just the woman everyone was laughing at. Ryan Whitaker looked up at her from the mat. She looked back. "Training complete, Master Sergeant." She said it without a trace of triumph. Without sharpness. Without the satisfaction that everyone in the formation, if they were honest, would have felt in her position. She said it the way someone says a thing that is simply true, and then she waited. Whitaker stayed on the mat for a moment longer than he needed to. Not because he was hurt, because he was thinking. He got up slowly. He didn't speak. He turned and walked off the mat, and the formation parted around him without anyone deciding to part, and the demonstration was over, and nobody said a word for what felt like a very long time. Brooks was the first person to speak. He wasn't addressing anyone in particular. He was just saying it to the air, to the field, to the specific quality of silence that had settled over 340 men, who had all just had the same experience simultaneously. He said, "Who is she?" It was a fair question. It was the question that nobody had thought to ask in 6 months. The answer was not simple. Claire Ann Morgan had grown up in a town called Harpswell, Maine, a narrow strip of peninsula on the coast where the Atlantic came in cold and constant, and you learned early that arguing with the weather was a waste of time, better spent figuring out how to work around it. Her father, Thomas Morgan, had run a lobster boat for 15 years until a winch accident took 2 fingers off his right hand and reduced his grip strength to the point where the work became too dangerous to do alone. Her mother, Joan, had worked simultaneously as a school secretary and a weekend waitress at the only sit-down restaurant in a 12-mile radius, and she had done this without complaint for 9 years, and she had never once suggested to Claire that the size of a person's life was fixed at birth. That was the first lesson Claire Morgan had received about strength. It came not from a speech or a teaching moment, but from watching her mother leave the house at 6:45 every morning and not return until 9:30 at night, and from understanding the way children understand things. They can't yet articulate that the person who kept going wasn't doing it because it was easy, or because she didn't notice it was hard. She was doing it because stopping had consequences she wasn't willing to accept. The second lesson came from her father after the accident. Thomas Morgan had sat in the kitchen of their house on a Tuesday afternoon. Claire was 11 at the time, and he had put his damaged hand flat on the table and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Claire had sat across from him. She hadn't asked what he was thinking. She'd learned already that her father communicated in long silences that eventually became words, and that interrupting the silence was the surest way to prevent the words. Finally, he'd looked up. "You know what the ocean never does," he said. She shook her head. "Apologizes for being the ocean." He looked back at his hand. "Doesn't mean it isn't sorry. Means it's got no time for sorry. It just keeps moving." She had thought about that sentence more times than she could count over the next 17 years. At 19, Claire enrolled in ROTC at the University of New Hampshire, which was the farthest from home she'd been willing to go and the closest thing to a plan she had. She graduated with a degree in kinesiology and a commission as an ensign, which surprised no one who'd watched her study and surprised everyone who'd only watched her grow up small and quiet in a fishing town. What came after the commission was harder to talk about. Not because it was classified, parts of it were, but that wasn't the reason for the silence. The reason was simpler. The story of how Claire Morgan became one of the very few women to enter a SEAL. Adjacent Special Operations Pipeline was a story made almost entirely of failure. And failure was not something that translated well into dinner table conversation or professional biography. She failed her first combat dive qualification. She failed it again 6 weeks later. She failed a land navigation assessment in conditions that would have been challenging for a man twice her size, and she sat in the after-action debrief and listened to a chief petty officer explain exactly what she'd done wrong, and she wrote it all down, and she went back and did it again. She failed 9 separate assessments over 14 months. She passed all of them eventually, not all at once. Not in a burst of sudden capability that proved she'd been ready all along and just needed the right circumstances. She passed them one at a time through a process so slow and incremental that most people who knew about it said it was evidence of something wrong with her rather than evidence of something right. You weren't supposed to take that long. The pipeline wasn't designed for that long. The entire system was built around the idea that if you couldn't keep pace, you were supposed to self-select out, not because anyone was trying to be cruel, but because the work itself would eventually require you to make decisions at speed under pressure with incomplete information. And if you couldn't perform in training, then the field would kill you. Claire understood this argument. She did not accept its conclusion as applied to herself. What carried her through those 14 months was something she could not fully explain, and therefore rarely tried to. The closest she'd come to articulating it was in a letter she'd written to her mother during a particularly bad week in the second year of training a week that had included 2 failed assessments and a superior officer strongly suggesting that she consider a conventional Navy career that would, he implied, be more suitable. She'd written, "I think what they don't understand is that I'm not here to prove something to them. I'm here because this is where I need to be, and the only person who gets to decide, that is me. The tests aren't the point. The tests are just the door. I'm going to open the door." She'd been selected for the pipeline 6 weeks later. None of this was in her service record in any form that Ryan Whitaker would have seen or thought to look for. What was in her record was a set of qualification codes that didn't mean much without context, and an assignment history that read linearly, looked like a series of lateral moves. What it actually was a map of operations that had never been publicly acknowledged. There was a period of 14 months listed in her record only as Special Assignment USSOCOM that covered activities Claire had not described in detail to anyone outside her immediate chain of command. She would not describe them now. What she had done during those 14 months, and with whom and in what countries, was the kind of information that lived in compartmented files and required a specific level of access to read. And Ryan Whitaker did not have that access, and he had never thought to ask anyone who did. What he had thought for 6 months was that he already knew what he needed to know. He'd seen her sighs. He'd seen her silence. He'd made a story out of those two things and repeated it daily in front of 340 Marines. And not one of them, including the people who privately respected her, had told him to stop. Because the joke was easy. Because the story was comfortable. Because a small, quiet woman who didn't argue back fit perfectly into a version of reality that required no revision. And Claire Morgan had watched this happen. She had watched it the way she'd watched the ocean from her father's boat when she was 7 years old, with patience, with attention, without the illusion that her feelings about the water had any effect on what the water did. She had made a calculation. It was not a passive calculation. She had weighed the cost of speaking against the cost of silence. And she had determined deliberately, consciously, with full awareness of what she was choosing, that silence served her current purpose better. She was there to evaluate joint combat readiness. She was there to observe and document. Walking into a conflict with the senior combatives instructor would not help her observe. It would make her the center of something, and being the center of something would compromise the clarity of her observations. There was also a second reason, one she acknowledged to herself more rarely. She had learned in 14 months of failure and recalibration, and the particular loneliness of being the only person in a room who hadn't decided to quit. She had learned that there was information in the way people behaved when they thought you couldn't hear them or couldn't fight back. The jokes Ryan Whitaker made were data. The silence of the men who didn't stop him was data. The shape of this particular culture, its reflexes and its blind spots, and the specific ways it failed to see what was in front of it all. Of that was useful information for an evaluation report that was supposed to tell someone senior enough to act what was actually happening inside this training division. She had been building that report for 6 months. And then Thursday morning happened, and Ryan Whitaker pointed at her in front of 340 Marines, and the calculation changed. Because there is patience that serves a purpose, and then there is a point at which patience becomes complicity. And she knew, standing at the back of that formation, that the point had arrived. Daniel Brooks had watched the entire exchange on the mat from approximately 8 feet away, and he was still processing it 20 minutes later when he found himself in the equipment bay running a post-training inventory that he was not actually thinking about. He was thinking about her feet. He was thinking about the quality of her movement, the kind that wasn't explosive or dramatic, but was so precisely calibrated to each incoming situation that it made the incoming situation's violence dissipate like water hitting a curved surface. He'd trained with black belts. He'd trained with competitive fighters who had championship records and 40 pounds on him. He'd sparred with men who'd been grappling since they were 8 years old. He had never seen someone move with that specific quality of what he could only call inevitability. Like each position she occupied was the only position that made sense given what was happening, and finding it required no effort because it had never been in question. It was, he thought, the product of either extraordinary natural talent or an almost incomprehensible volume of training and watching her face during the exchange. He'd seen nothing that looked like talent. Talent had a quality of surprise to it, a slight widening of the eyes when something worked that the talented person hadn't quite expected. What Claire Morgan's face had shown was something different: recognition. The same recognition you'd see on a master carpenter who hits a joint perfectly and nods slightly, not because they're surprised, but because they knew it was going to fit. Brooks had come up through the system in a way that made him sensitive to this distinction. He'd grown up in Baltimore. His father had worked for the city. His mother had raised 4 children in a row house on a street where the calculation of who was going to amount to something was made early and revised rarely. Brooks had been told at various points, and by various people whose opinions he'd initially respected, that he was too slow, too big, too loud, too anything, whatever the current argument was, for why his ambitions exceeded his reasonable prospects. He'd ignored all of it. Not because he was certain they were wrong, but because certainty had nothing to do with it. You didn't have to be certain. You had to keep moving. I was 34 now. He'd been in the Marine Corps for 11 years. He'd earned his rank through work so consistent and quiet that his personnel file was, in his commander's words, boring in exactly the right way. He knew what it looked like when someone was being dismissed for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual capability, because he had been dismissed that way himself. And the memory of it lived in him with the particular clarity of an injury that healed wrong, not debilitating, not gone, just always slightly present as a reminder. And standing in the equipment bay, running his inventory and not thinking about his inventory. He was experiencing something that he recognized as the specific discomfort of having participated by silence in something he should have interrupted. He hadn't laughed at Whitaker's jokes, but he hadn't said anything either. And the distinction between those two things, which had felt significant when he was making it, I'm not part of this, I'm just not stopping it, which is different, felt considerably less significant now than it had 6 months ago. He closed his inventory clipboard. He went to find Claire Morgan. She was in the secondary training bay alone, running through what appeared to be a specific series of shoulder mobility exercises, with the careful attention of someone addressing an old injury rather than building new capability. She didn't stop when Brooks came in. She tracked him in her peripheral vision, but didn't turn. He stopped a few feet away. He waited. She finished the movement sequence reset and then looked at him. "Sergeant Brooks, Lieutenant." He paused. "You trained SEAL Pipeline." She looked at him for a moment. Then, "I went through a selection process." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "Yes." Brooks nodded slowly. He looked at the floor, then back at her. "How long?" "Long enough." He almost smiled. But there was something he needed to say, and he didn't want the moment to pass before he said it. "I should have said something about the comments over the past 6 months." He looked at her directly. "I didn't. That's on me." Claire studied him. Her expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted in it, a slight adjustment that might have been the beginning of something warmer. "Why didn't you?" "Because it wasn't my fight. And now I've seen enough to know that that reasoning was wrong." He shook his head slightly. "It wasn't my fight to pick, but it was my silence to give. That was a choice. I made it wrong." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, through the bay's open side, the distant sounds of the training field continued. Voices, equipment, the normal daily noise of 340 Marines doing their work. Finally, she said, "You watched my feet." He blinked. "What?" "During the demonstration, I heard you tell Gutierrez to watch my feet. You recognized the movement before it resolved." She tilted her head slightly. "You trained in grappling." 11 years, he said. "Then you knew what you were watching." "Yes." "And you knew before the demonstration was over how it was going to end." Brooks thought about denying it. He decided against it. "Probably around the second exchange, yes." "But you didn't say anything." "No." "Why not?" He considered the question honestly. "Because it wasn't my moment to speak. And because I wanted to see how you handled it." He paused. "I wanted to see if you'd handle it the way I thought you would." "And did I?" "You told him training was complete." Brooks shook his head slowly with something that was close to admiration and was uncomfortable for him because he wasn't used to it feeling uncomfortable. "Yeah. You handled it exactly the way I thought you would." Claire Morgan looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded a single definitive nod and turned back to her mobility exercises. Brooks stood in the secondary bay for another minute. Then he left. He spent the rest of that afternoon writing something in the small notebook he kept in his left breast pocket. He didn't show it to anyone. I wasn't entirely sure why he was writing it. He thought it might be the beginning of something he owed not to Claire Morgan specifically, but to the version of himself that had made a choice 6 months ago, and was now trying to understand whether that version of himself was still who he wanted to be. He wrote at the top of the page, "The biggest mistake you can make is thinking quiet means weak." He didn't know then that he would one day say those exact words to a room full of young Marines who needed to hear them. He only knew that they were true, and that he had needed 17 minutes in an equipment bay and a secondary training bay conversation to arrive at them, and that they should not have taken this long. Outside across the base, Ryan Whitaker was in his office. He was sitting at his desk. He was not doing any of the work that was on his desk. He was thinking about a woman who had put him on the mat in front of 340 Marines and then told him training was complete without a trace of satisfaction in her voice. And he was trying to figure out whether the absence of satisfaction was a form of contempt or a form of something else entirely that he didn't yet have a word for. He pulled open his laptop. He typed her name into the personnel search system. He started to read. And the more he read, or rather the more he encountered the systematic absence of information in places where information should have been, the redacted blocks and the classified markers and the vague special assignment notations that didn't say enough to be meaningful, but said exactly enough to imply what wasn't being said, the more Ryan Whitaker understood that he had spent 6 months making jokes about a person he had never bothered to know. And knowing this, really knowing it not as an abstract acknowledgement, but as a concrete and uncomfortable and specific fact, was a different kind of weight than he had carried into the morning. He sat with it for a long time. The training field outside his window was quiet now. 340 Marines had dispersed to their afternoon duties. The mat was empty, the demonstration was over. But something had started that morning that Ryan Whitaker was beginning to understand was not going to end when the day ended. Something had cracked open, and the crack ran through him. Ryan Whitaker closed his laptop at 6:47 p.m. He had been staring at Claire Morgan's personnel file, or rather at the spaces where her personnel file should have been, for nearly 4 hours. What he'd found wasn't nothing. There were dates, assignment codes, unit designations that existed as bureaucratic placeholders without substance behind them. There was a physical fitness record that was on its face. Unremarkable scores that cleared the required thresholds without advertising anything. There was a list of training qualifications that read like a standard officer progression until you looked at the sequence and noticed that the timeline didn't add up, that certain courses happened too fast or in the wrong order, or at installations that didn't officially run the kind of training those courses implied. And then there were the gaps. 14 months. A notation that read USSOCOM Special Assignment, and nothing beneath it. No after-action reports. No performance evaluations for the period. No documentation of what she'd done, or where she'd been, or with whom. In a personnel system that generated paperwork, the way the ocean generated water. 14 months of nothing meant something specific. It meant someone had deliberately removed the information, or had ensured it was never entered in the first place. Whitaker had been in the military long enough to know that kind of erasure wasn't bureaucratic error. That was protection. That was a classification decision made by someone with enough authority to enforce it for reasons that were almost certainly operational. He sat with that understanding for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Chief Warrant Officer Dennis Farr, who had 22 years in naval special warfare and who Whitaker had served alongside briefly in 2018, and who owed him a favor that had never been formally acknowledged. Farr picked up on the second ring. Whitaker, I need you to tell me something. That depends heavily on what you're asking. Lieutenant Claire Morgan, Navy, currently attached to my training division at Pendleton. Silence on the line. Not the silence of someone who didn't recognize the name. The different silence, the brief pause of someone deciding how much to say. What about her? Farr said finally. I need to know who she actually is. Another pause. Why? Whitaker said it plainly because he'd decided on the drive back to his office that he was done with angles. Because I've been making jokes at her expense in front of 340 Marines for 6 months. And this morning she put me on the mat in front of all of them, and I went back and looked at her file, and there's nothing in it that should be nothing. Farr was quiet for 5 full seconds. Then, you put her on the mat. I invited her to demonstrate. Yes, Ryan. Farr's voice carried something that wasn't quite amusement, and wasn't quite sympathy, and was mostly just the tone of a man who has seen a specific kind of mistake made before, and recognizes it on contact. What exact do you think that assignment code on her file means? That's what I'm calling to ask. I can't give you specifics, you know that. I'm not asking for specifics, I'm asking for enough. Farr exhaled slowly. Enough for what? Enough to understand what I've been doing for 6 months. The line was quiet for a moment. When Farr spoke again, his voice was measured and careful. I'll tell you this much. The women who make it through what she went through, the selection process, the operational assignments, the whole thing, they don't make it through because the standards were lowered. They make it through because the standards weren't. He paused. And the ones who stay quiet about it aren't staying quiet because they're weak. They're staying quiet because they've learned that proving yourself twice to every room you walk into is the cost of doing business, and they've decided the business is worth it. Whitaker said nothing. Whatever she did out there in those 14 months, Farr continued, it was real, and it was ugly, and she came back from it, and she got assigned to your training division to evaluate readiness, and she's been doing that job for 6 months while you've been making jokes. He paused again. How'd the demonstration go? Whitaker looked at the wall. She took me down in about 90 seconds. Yeah. Farr didn't say anything else for a moment. Yeah, that sounds right. They ended the call. Whitaker sat in his office until the base went to evening quiet, and then he sat a little longer. 3 buildings away. Claire Morgan was on the phone with someone she hadn't spoken to in 4 months. Commander Patricia Osei. Pat, to the people who'd earned that, was the officer who had sponsored Claire's entry into the SEAL support pipeline 7 years ago, had tracked her progress through 14 months of failure and eventual qualification, and who now ran a joint special operations training assessment program from an office in Virginia that was listed on no public directory. She was 51 years old and had the particular voice of someone who had long ago stopped using volume to communicate authority. I heard something happen today, Osei said. It wasn't a question. You heard quickly. I have people. A brief pause. Tell me. Claire sat on the edge of her bunk and looked at the wall across from her with the same quality of attention she gave everything. The particular focus of someone who doesn't find any subject beneath full concentration. Whitaker invited me to demonstrate, in front of the full training formation. And I demonstrated. Silence on the line. Then, Claire. I initiated. I responded. The demonstration concluded appropriately. That is the most technically correct description of something I've ever heard from you. Osei's voice held the very edge of amusement held there with effort. Are you all right? I'm fine. That's not what I asked. Claire considered the question seriously, the way she considered all questions, not rushing toward an answer, but actually listening to what was being asked. I've been fine. For 6 months I've been fine. Today I chose to stop pretending the situation was something other than what it was. What made today different? He pointed at me in front of 340 people, Claire said. He did it as a joke. He did it because every other joke for 6 months hadn't gotten a reaction, and this time he decided to escalate. She paused. If I walked away from that mat, that was the story for the rest of the assignment. That was the story that followed the evaluation report. I wasn't willing to let that be the story. Osei was quiet for a moment. The evaluation report is what I want to talk about. Claire straightened slightly. This was the other thing. The thing beneath the surface of the morning's events. The thing she'd been building toward for 6 months, with the patience she'd learned from 14 months of failing and trying again. What did you find? Osei asked. The readiness picture is better than the numbers suggest, and worse than the culture suggests, Claire said. The technical training is solid. Individual capability is high. Whitaker is genuinely good at what he does. I want to be accurate about that. The problem isn't capability, it's integration. Meaning there are 12 joint assignment personnel currently attached to this division from 4 different branches, and the informal hierarchy that governs day-to-day interaction has nothing to do with rank or qualification, and everything to do with how long someone has been here, and who laughs at whose jokes. She paused. 3 of those 12 personnel are underperforming on objective metrics. All 3 are from non-marine branches. All 3 have been here less than 8 months. All 3 have been the subject of the kind of casual dismissal that looks like humor but functions as marginalization. And the 4th, Osei said. The 4th is me. Another pause. You included yourself in the report. I am the most documented case because I've been observing my own situation with the same methodology I've been observing theirs. It would be dishonest not to include it." Osei said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's going to make the report harder to dismiss. That's why I included it. It's also going to make things uncomfortable for you personally." "Things have been uncomfortable for me personally for 6 months," Claire said. That was already the situation. The question was whether the discomfort produced something useful, or whether it just existed. She paused. "I'd rather it produce something useful." Osei made a sound that might have been admiration, and might have been concern, and was probably both simultaneously. "How much longer do you need?" 4 weeks, 6 if something changes." "Something changed today." "Yes," Claire said. "But not in a way that compromises the evaluation, in a way that accelerates it." She paused. "Whitaker is going to have questions. He's already started looking at my file. Farr is going to tell him something I don't know what exactly, but enough. And when Whitaker starts asking questions, the other people in the division will notice him asking questions, and the culture will start to shift in ways I can document." The line was quiet for a moment. Then Osei said, "You planned this." It wasn't an accusation, it was recognition. "I didn't plan the demonstration," Claire said carefully. "He created the demonstration. I made a decision in the moment about whether to participate and how." She paused. "But I understood what the demonstration would produce." "Yes." "And you're comfortable with that?" The question sat between them for a moment. "I'm comfortable with using what's available," Claire said finally. "I'm not comfortable with having spent 6 months listening to the same joke. But the discomfort was already there. I didn't manufacture it. I just stopped letting it be wasted." The next morning, the energy on the base was different in a way that had no official cause and would not have been acknowledged in any document, but was nonetheless real and felt by everyone who moved through it. Sergeant Hodges, the staff sergeant who had shouted the joke, arrived at morning formation and found that the 2 Marines he usually stood next to had shifted position slightly without explanation, creating a gap that forced him to stand either in that gap or find a new place in the line. It was a small thing. It was not small. He stood in the gap. During the morning briefing, the division's executive officer, Major Sandra Reyes, who had been at Camp Pendleton for 3 years, and who had a reputation for precision that occasionally bordered on unkindness, reviewed the previous day's training log. When she reached the notation for the combatives demonstration, she paused. "Whitaker," she said, "walk me through the demonstration." The room shifted its attention to the senior combatives instructor in a way that had a different quality than attention usually had. Whitaker stood. Live demonstration of control and takedown technique with Lieutenant Morgan from the attached joint personnel. She demonstrated significant technical proficiency. He said it cleanly, without qualification, without softening, without the kind of framing that would have managed the story. He said it the way he would have said it if it had been anyone else. Reyes looked at him for a moment. Noted. She moved to the next item, but the word proficiency lingered in the room in a way that words didn't usually linger in morning briefings, and several people around the table made small recalibrations in their internal working models of the situation, without being aware they were doing it. Claire was not in the morning briefing. She was in the secondary training bay again, working through a conditioning sequence that she ran every morning at 05:30, regardless of what the day held. She had been doing some version of this sequence since she was 22 years old. It was not something she thought about consciously anymore. It was part of what she was. Brooks found her there at 06:10. He stood in the doorway for a moment, not interrupting, just watching, and then stepped in when she paused at the end of a cycle. "I talked to Gutierrez last night," he said. She waited. "He said he's been thinking about a conversation he had with Specialist Tran from the Army Liaison Team 3 months ago. Apparently Tran said something in passing about feeling like her observations weren't being taken seriously in the joint planning sessions." He paused. Gutierrez said he nodded and moved on. Claire looked at him steadily. "He's not sure why he did that," Brooks continued. "He's been in this division for 2 years. He knows Tran. He knows she's sharp. He just moved on." He shook his head. He told me he thought about it half the night. What did you tell him? I told him the thinking was good, that he should keep it up. Brooks crossed his arms loosely. I also told him that thinking without doing is just expensive feeling bad about yourself. Something shifted in Claire's expression. Not a smile exactly, but the specific quality of warmth that appears in someone's face when they hear something that lands exactly right. That's accurate, she said. What do you need us to do? Brooks asked. The question was direct. It surprised her, not because she hadn't expected Brooks to get there eventually, but because she hadn't expected him to get there this quickly, with this lack of preamble. She studied him for a moment. I need you to do what you already did. Keep thinking, keep watching, and if you see something that should be named, name it. She paused. That's all. That's the whole thing. That's it. That's almost never easy, she said, which is why it almost never gets done. Brooks looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded in that particular way of his, the one she'd noticed during the demonstration, the one that meant he'd processed something and filed it, and was moving forward. All right. He left. She stood in the secondary bay alone for a minute after he left. Then she started the next cycle of her conditioning sequence. The first person to say something directly to Hodges about the joke was not Brooks, and it was not Whitaker, and it was not anyone that Hodges would have expected. It was Corporal Darnell Webb, 23 years old, 14 months in the Corps, the most junior Marine in Hodges's immediate unit, and the last person Hodges would have anticipated a direct challenge from. It happened in the equipment storage room during afternoon gear maintenance, which was exactly the kind of low-supervision environment where the things that actually mattered to people got said. Hodges was running a maintenance check on a set of radio harnesses. Webb was 3 feet away doing the same with a different batch. They'd been working in silence for about 10 minutes when Webb said without looking up from his work, "That joke was wrong, Staff Sergeant." Hodges looked up. "What?" Webb kept his eyes on the harness in his hands. His voice was steady, not confrontational, not afraid, just even. "Yesterday. Careful she bites. That was wrong." The room was quiet. It was just the two of them. Hodges stared at the corporal. A year ago, a month ago, his response would have been automatic. A flash of authority, a reminder of rank, a question about what exactly a corporal thought he was doing, offering opinions on a staff sergeant's conduct. He had 17 years of conditioned reflex behind that response. He felt it rise. He let it go. He looked back down at the radio harness. "Yeah," he said. Webb looked up then. "Staff Sergeant." "Yeah." Hodges didn't look at him. He worked a clasp on the harness, checked the connection, moved to the next. It was wrong. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It had weight to it. The weight of something that had been said and couldn't be unsaid and was now part of the air in the room, permanent, regardless of what happened next. Webb went back to his work. After a minute, Hodges said, "You know anything about her, Morgan?" "No, Staff Sergeant." "Neither did I." He paused. That was the problem. Claire found out about the exchange between Webb and Hodges, the way she found out about most things on the base, not through official channels, not through gossip, but through the specific atmospheric quality of a culture in the early stages of examining itself. Webb didn't tell her. Hodges certainly didn't tell her. But there were shifts, small ones, the kind you only noticed if you'd been watching for them in the way people moved around her. Less performance of ignoring. More simple acknowledgement. Eye contact held a beat longer. Nods that carried something. She documented all of it. Not because it was evidence of anything dramatic, because it was evidence of the actual mechanism of culture change, which was not dramatic and did not announce itself, but moved through a population the way a temperature shift moves through water, invisibly, gradually, and then suddenly pervasively, in a way that made the previous temperature feel like a different time entirely. She was in the middle of updating her field notes when Major Reyes appeared at the door of the small office space that had been designated for the joint evaluation work. Reyes knocked once, a courtesy, not a request for permission, and stepped in. She was 44, compact with short natural hair, and the kind of bearing that communicated that she had never once questioned whether she belonged in the room she was walking into. She closed the door behind her and sat in the chair across from Claire's workstation without being invited, which told Claire immediately that this was not a social visit. "Lieutenant Morgan?" "Major Reyes." Reyes looked at her directly. "Tell me about the evaluation." It wasn't a request phrased as a request. It was a senior officer in her command space asking a subordinate for information she was entitled to have. Claire closed her field notes. "I wasn't aware you had visibility into the evaluation scope." "I have visibility into everything that happens in this division," Reyes said. "I've had visibility into your assignment since you arrived. I've been watching just like you've been watching." She paused. "I've been doing it longer." Claire looked at her steadily. She recalibrated. "What do you want to know?" she said. "What's your finding on the integration failure, the joint personnel?" "I haven't reached a formal finding yet." Informally. A pause. "The division's culture creates a consistent low-level pressure on non-organic personnel that functions as a performance tax. The tax is not explicit, not documented, not intentional in most individual cases, and not recognized by the people imposing it as something that's happening. The result is suppressed reporting on observed problems, reduced participation in planning processes, and a pattern of deference to the informal hierarchy that in 3 documented cases is producing measurable degradation in output quality." She paused. "That's informal." Reyes said nothing for a moment. Then, "How long have you known about the 3 cases?" "In detail, about 4 months." "And you let it continue?" It wasn't a question. "I was documenting it," Claire said carefully. "You were letting 3 people operate in a degraded environment while you documented their degradation." Reyes's voice wasn't harsh. It was precise. There was a difference. Claire felt the weight of it. "Yes." "Is that the right call?" The question was genuine. Reyes was asking it the way a person asks a question they don't already have an answer to. Claire took a breath. "I don't know," she said. "I've been asking myself that." She paused. "The documentation is what makes intervention possible. Without the documentation, you can say something is wrong, and the institutional response is to ask for evidence. I was building evidence." Another pause. "But I was also watching people be diminished while I built it, and I'm not fully comfortable with that trade." Reyes looked at her for a long moment. "Good." Claire blinked. "Major, the discomfort is appropriate." Reyes leaned forward slightly. "The discomfort means your moral reasoning is functioning. An operator who built that documentation without discomfort would be someone I'd be concerned about." She paused. "The trade was probably right. The discomfort is also right. Both things can be true." Something in Claire's chest eased slightly, in a way she hadn't expected and hadn't known she was waiting for. "The 3 personnel," Reyes said. "I want names, and I want your documented observations, not the formal report, the working notes, today. I can have them to you by 1600. 1500. 1500, Claire said. Reyes stood. She moved toward the door, and then stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back. "Lieutenant, yesterday morning." Claire waited. "You made a decision on that, Matt." Reyes looked at her steadily. "It was the right decision. But I want you to know you didn't have to wait 6 months for permission to make it." She left. Claire sat with that sentence for a long time after the door closed. Ryan Whitaker came to find her at 11:30. He didn't knock. He stopped in the doorway and stood there in the specific quality of his stillness, so different from the controlled aggression he usually occupied space with, told her everything she needed to know about the conversation before it started. She looked up from her notes. He said, "I called far." "I know," she said. He absorbed that without reacting. "He didn't tell me details." "He wouldn't. He told me enough." Whitaker stepped into the office without being invited the way Reyes had, but the gesture read entirely differently. Less authority, more necessity. The movement of someone who needs to say something and isn't sure of his footing and is moving toward the conversation rather than away from it, because moving away has stopped being an option. He didn't sit. He stood near the door, which was either respect for her space Or an exit strategy, or both? I looked at your file. Most of it's redacted. Enough wasn't. He paused. Why didn't you say something 6 months? Any time? Claire looked at him. What would I have said? That you'd been through, that you had the background to. He stopped himself. Started again. You could have told me to stop. Yes, she said. I could have. Why didn't you? She considered how much to say. She'd had this conversation in her head dozens of times over the past 6 months. Not with Whitaker specifically, but with the version of this question that lived in her own reasoning. The question she asked herself every time she chose silence. She'd answered it differently on different days. Today she felt like answering it fully. Because the joke wasn't really about me, she said. Whitaker frowned. What do you mean? The joke was about what you were comfortable assuming. About a category of person. She paused. If I'd corrected you the first time, you would have stopped joking. In front of me. With me aware. The assumption underneath the joke would have stayed exactly where it was. She looked at him steadily. The assumption was the problem, not the joke. And assumptions don't change because someone tells them to. They change because reality contradicts them in a way that can't be rationalized. Whitaker stood very still. Yesterday morning, she continued, 340 Marines experienced a contradiction. Not because I told them their assumption was wrong. Because it was visibly, demonstrably, undeniably wrong in front of all of them at the same time. She paused. You can dismiss one person's testimony. You can't undismiss a thing you watched happen. The room was quiet. Whitaker said after a moment, that was deliberate. The decision to step on the mat was deliberate, she said. Everything after that was just what was true. He looked at the wall beside her, then back at her. The jokes, starting from week 1, I didn't know what I was doing. No, she agreed. You didn't. That's not... He stopped. That's not an excuse. I know it's not. I didn't say it was. He looked at her directly now, and there was something in his face that she'd never seen there before in 6 months of sharing space with him. Not discomfort, which she'd seen, not frustration, which she'd seen plenty of. Something rawer. Something that looked like a man standing in the specific position of having understood something he would have preferred not to understand, and choosing to stay in that position instead of finding a way out of it. I'm going to address it, he said. With the formation, publicly. You don't have to, she said. I know. He paused. I'm going to anyway. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once the same definitive nod she'd given Brooks in the secondary bay, the one that meant she'd assessed something and found it honest and was accepting it without additional comment. Whitaker turned to leave. He stopped with his hand on the doorframe, the same gesture Reyes had made, and looked back. How long have you been writing the evaluation report? He said. 6 months, she said. Something moved across his face. Am I in it? The culture is in it, she said. You're part of the culture. He nodded slowly. All right. He left. Claire turned back to her notes. She sat for a moment without moving. Then she opened a new page and began writing. Outside the window, 340 Marines were doing their work. The base hummed with its ordinary daily sounds. Somewhere across the training grounds, she could hear Whitaker's voice carrying a formation through an afternoon drill and the quality of his instruction. The specific authority of a man who was genuinely good at what he did sounded through the distance the same as it always had. But something had shifted in what surrounded it, and that shift, she knew, was only the beginning of what was coming. The working notes Claire delivered to Major Reyes at 14:58 on Thursday afternoon were 41 pages long. Reyes read them in her office with the door closed and did not emerge for 2 hours. When she did emerge, she walked directly to the division's administrative section, requested 3 personnel files, and returned to her office without speaking to anyone. The administrative clerk, a lance corporal named Estevez, who had been at Pendleton for 7 months, and who had a gift for reading institutional weather, told Gutierrez at evening chow that the major had the specific face she got when something was wrong, and she already knew what she was going to do about it. Gutierrez told Brooks. Brooks told no one. He sat with it through the meal and then went back to his quarters and sat with it some more. The 3 personnel files Reyes had requested belonged to Specialist Angela Tran, Petty Officer 2nd Class, Marcus Webb, no relation to Corporal Darnell Webb, and Staff Sergeant Yolanda Price, who was Army Reserve on a joint assignment rotation and who had been at Pendleton for 5 months. All 3 were the cases Claire had documented. All 3 had performance notations in the past 90 days that used the specific language of institutional hedging phrases like requires additional integration and still adapting to divisional culture. That sounded like observations about the individuals, but were, if you read them against Claire's 41 pages of field notes, actually descriptions of what the division had done to them. Reyes saw this immediately. She had seen variations of it before across 3 previous commands, and each time she had seen it, she had made the same calculation she was making now. How much of this was intentional? How much was ambient? And how much of the difference between those 2 categories actually mattered when it came to what needed to be fixed? Her answer was always the same. Not much. The damage was real regardless of the intention. The fix had to be real, regardless of who felt implicated. She picked up her phone and called the division's senior administrative officer, Captain Herrera, and told him she needed a command climate review initiated by Monday morning. Herrera said, "Can I ask what prompted this?" Reyes said, "The evaluation report we've been hosting for 6 months." A pause. Morgan's report. "Her working notes came to me today. The formal report goes up the chain in approximately 4 weeks." She paused. "I'd like the command climate review to be well underway before that report arrives at anyone's desk above mine." Another pause. This one longer. Herrera was processing the implication, which was clear Reyes was not waiting to be told there was a problem. She was acting on information she already had in a window. She was choosing which put the division in the position of having self-identified and self-corrected, rather than having been externally flagged. "Understood," Herrera said. Monday morning. "Thank you, Captain." She ended the call and sat for a moment in the specific quiet of someone who has set something in motion that cannot be stopped and is examining her own certainty about that decision. Then she opened Claire's notes again to the section she had marked with a folded corner. The section that was not about the 3 documented cases, and not about Ryan Whitaker's pattern of dismissal, but about something else entirely. Something Claire had written about in careful, measured language that was nonetheless the most alarming thing in the 41 pages. Reyes read it again. Then she picked up her phone and made a second call. This one not to Herrera. Claire didn't know about the second call. She wouldn't know about it for another 72 hours. What she knew on Friday morning was that the base felt different again, a further increment of the atmospheric shift that had been building since Thursday morning on the mat. She moved through her Duro 5:30 conditioning sequence, showered, and arrived at the Joint Evaluation Office at Duro 6:20 to find a folded note on her desk in Reyes's handwriting. It said, "Good work. Stay available today." She sat down and looked at the note for a moment. Then she set it aside and opened her working file. She had been building toward the section of the report she least wanted to write for 3 weeks. She'd been documenting the cases, noting the cultural patterns mapping the informal hierarchies and their effects. All of that was uncomfortable, but navigable. The kind of discomfort that came with any honest assessment of an institution that was trying to maintain a self-image at variance with its actual behavior. That was familiar work. She knew how to do it. What she was looking at now was different. 6 weeks ago, she had noticed something in the joint planning session data that didn't fit the pattern she'd been building. A specific set of after-action discrepancies, not errors exactly, but a consistent gap between what was reported in formal documentation and what she'd observed during the exercises themselves. Small gaps, each individually explainable. Collectively, they formed a shape. She had spent 3 weeks trying to find an innocent explanation for that shape. She'd been thorough about it. She'd gone back through the documentation 4 times, from 4 different analytical angles, looking for the place where her observation was wrong, or her methodology was flawed, or there was a data artifact producing a false pattern. She hadn't found it. What she'd found instead during her second full review was a name, It appeared twice, once in a planning document where it shouldn't have been, and once in a communications log where it was listed as a recipient of information that should not have been routed there. Both instances could be explained away individually. Together, in the context of the other discrepancies, they couldn't. The name was Staff Sergeant Robert Cahill. Cahill was Marine Organic to the division, not a joint assignment. He had 8 years of service, a clean record, and a working relationship with Whitaker that was close enough that they were frequently paired for training assignments. How was well liked, competent, the kind of person who existed in the background of an institution's social ecosystem without drawing attention or generating controversy. How was also based on Claire's analysis, the source of at least 3 operational data leaks in the past 4 months. She had not put this in the 41 pages she gave Reyes. She had put it in a separate document that she had not given to anyone, that existed only on her encrypted personal device, that she had been sitting on for 2 weeks while she confirmed the pattern one more time and thought about what it meant to accuse a well-liked Marine of something that, if she was right, was a federal offense, and if she was wrong, would make everything she'd already found about the division's cultural problems look like personal grievance rather than professional assessment. She had confirmed the pattern one more time on Wednesday night. She was not wrong. The question was not whether to report it. That question had a clear answer that she'd known from the moment she recognized the shape. The question was how and to whom and in what order, and whether to tell Reyes first or go directly to the chain that handled this category of problem. The chain that existed above the division, above Camp Pendleton, in the specific institutional territory where information compromises lived and were investigated by people whose entire professional existence was built around understanding what had gone where and why. She had been sitting on this decision for 2 weeks. She picked up her phone. She called Commander Osei in Virginia. Osei answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call, or had been awake already, or both. "Tell me," Osei said. "I have a second track in the evaluation," Claire said. "Separate from the cultural assessment. I need to know if I should bring it to Reyes or go above the division." A short silence. "How serious?" "Potential operational data compromise. 4 months of documentation. 3 confirmed leaks, 2 probable." She paused. 1 identified subject. The silence on Osei's end was the particular quality of silence that belongs to someone who is not surprised but is recalculating rapidly. "Marine." "Yes." "How confident are you?" "I've reviewed it 4 times. The pattern is consistent. The coincidences required to make it innocent are compounding to the point of implausibility." She paused. 92%. "That's a high number from you." "It's an accurate number." Osei was quiet for 3 seconds. "Don't go to Reyes first. This goes to NCIS directly. I'll make the call from this end to alert them you follow up with your documentation within the hour. They'll handle it from there." She paused. "You're going to be asked to stay quiet about this internally until they have their own picture built." "I understand." "Claire." Osei's voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more present. "This is going to complicate the cultural assessment. When it comes out, and it will come out, there will be people who look at the timing and decide the leak investigation and the cultural findings are connected, that you used one to cover for the other, or vice versa. I know. It's going to be messy. Most things worth doing are." A pause. Then, 40 minutes. Have the documentation ready. The call ended. Claire sat still for exactly 60 seconds. Then she opened her encrypted file and began preparing the documentation package. She sent it at 0714. At 0716, she closed the file and sat back and felt the particular physical sensation of having set something irreversible in motion. Not regret, not relief. Just the clean, heavy knowledge that the clock had started and nothing that happened next would happen on her timeline. She went to the training field and observed the morning block as if nothing had changed. Brooks found her at the field's edge during the first break in the training schedule. He stood beside her, not too close, not performing distance, and watched the formation run through a movement drill. "You look like someone who just made a hard decision," he said. "I look the same as I always look," she said. "That's how I know." He watched the drill for a moment. Anything I should know about? Not yet. He nodded. He didn't push. She'd come to respect that about him, the particular discipline of someone who had learned the difference between being present and being intrusive, who understood that availability was not the same as pressure. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes. Then Brooks said, "Cahill was late to yesterday's formation." Claire turned to look at him. Her expression didn't change. "Is that unusual?" "For Cahill, yes. He's never late." Brooks kept his eyes on the drill. He was also on his phone during the briefing. Pocket not authorized. I noticed because Whitaker would normally have called it. He didn't. "Why are you telling me this?" Brooks was quiet for a moment. "Because I've been watching you watch things for 6 months, and I've started to understand what watching actually looks like when it's done right. And this morning I was doing it, and I noticed something that felt like it mattered." He paused. "If I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong." Claire looked at the training field. "You're not wrong to notice," she said carefully. "That's not the same as telling me I'm wrong." "No," she agreed. "It's not." Brooks absorbed that. He turned it over in his mind and felt the shape of what she wasn't saying and made the decision that a man who had spent 11 years learning the discipline of knowing when to ask and when to simply remain available made in that situation. He stopped pushing. "All right," he said. He stayed beside her for another minute. Then he moved back toward the formation. Claire watched him go. She was thinking about timing. About the 48 to 72 hours that Osei had implied NCIS would need to build their initial picture. About the specific vulnerability of those hours during which Cahill would continue to occupy his normal place in the division's daily operations, with no idea that the documentation had moved, and during which any significant change in his behavior could either be the result of nothing or the result of something that would matter enormously. She was also thinking about Whitaker. Whitaker, who trusted Cahill, who had worked beside him for 3 years, who paired with him for training assignments, who, based on everything she'd observed, considered him a known quantity in the comfortable way you considered a person when you'd never had reason to look at them carefully. She needed Whitaker to continue not looking carefully for the next 72 hours, which meant she needed everything between them to continue developing in the direction it had been developing, not accelerating, not stalling, just continuing with the natural pace of two people who had started to understand each other after a long period of misunderstanding. She walked to find Whitaker at the break. Howe was at the equipment station at the field's north edge, running a post-block check with 2 junior Marines. He dismissed them when he saw her coming, not pointedly, just efficiently finishing the check and sending them back to the formation with a word. He looked at her. "Morgan." "Whitaker." She stopped a few feet away. "How'd the block run?" "Fine." He paused. "Better than fine, actually. Tran ran a correction sequence on the third element that she hasn't been willing to run in front of the division before." He said it with the directness of a man who had started paying attention to things he'd previously let sit below his threshold. Something changed for her. "She's been capable of it for months," Claire said. "I know that now." He held her gaze. "I didn't know it before because I wasn't watching her the right way." A pause. "That's on me." "It's fixable," she said. "It is." He nodded slowly. "Reyes told me this morning about the command climate review." Claire said nothing. "I'm not—" He stopped, restarted. "I'm not going to pretend that's comfortable. Having a review initiated because of things that happened in my training division under my watch." He looked at the field. "But she's right to do it, and I'm going to cooperate with it fully." "I know you will," Claire said. He looked at her. "You know that I've been watching you for 6 months," she said. "You don't know how to do things halfway. It's one of your better qualities." She paused. "It's also occasionally your worst one." The edge of something moved across his face, not quite a smile, the thing that came before a smile, the recognition that a moment has a kind of honesty in it that makes smiling feel inadequate. "Fair," he said. They stood for a moment in the particular companionship of two people who have been through something that clarified them to each other and are still calibrating the space on the other side of it. Then Claire said, "How well do you know Cahill?" The question was casual. Her voice was level. She had spent 20 minutes deciding how to ask it, what tone to use, what angle of approach would read as natural, given the flow of the conversation. She had landed on direct, but embedded a question that could be a question about Cahill, or a question about how well Whitaker knew the people around him, depending on how he heard it. He heard it as the former. Rob. He frowned slightly. 8 years. He came up under me in advanced training, solid Marine. He paused. Why? Brooks mentioned he was late to formation yesterday. I don't know his patterns well enough to know if that's notable. Whitaker's frown deepened. Not suspicion, just the natural process of someone checking an observation against their existing data. That's not like him. He's usually first in. He thought for a moment. He did seem off this week. I put it down to personal stuff. He's been dealing with something with his family. Got it, Claire said. Just making sure I have an accurate picture of divisional patterns. Part of the evaluation. Everything is part of the evaluation. He nodded. The moment passed. He turned back toward the field to call the formation back to order, and Claire walked back toward the evaluation office, and nothing in the exchange would have looked like anything to anyone watching. But she had what she needed. She stopped by the edge of the field and sent a 3-word encrypted message to the contact number NCIS had provided through OSI's initial call. Subject unaware. Proceeding. The reply came in 40 seconds. Understood. Maintain.
Star.
What happened next did not happen slowly. At 13:40 on Friday afternoon, while the division was running a joint operations planning session in the main briefing room, Major Reyes's phone rang. She stepped out of the room to take the call. She was gone for 9 minutes. When she returned, she sat at the head of the table and waited for the current presenter to finish a point. And then she said in a voice that contained nothing alarming whatsoever, "We're going to take a 15-minute break. Get coffee. Be back at 1400. The room dispersed. Whitaker was pouring coffee at the side station when Reyes appeared beside him. She spoke quietly and without any visible urgency. "I need you to behave absolutely normally for the next 2 hours, she said. "Can you do that?" Whitaker looked at her. "Sandra," he said, using her first name for possibly the 3rd time in 3 years. "What's happening?" "I need your answer first." He held her gaze for a moment. Then, "Yes." "Good." She moved back toward the table. Absolutely normal, everything exactly as it was. He poured his coffee. He returned to his seat. He made a comment to the Marine on his left about the afternoon schedule that was perfectly ordinary, and his voice was perfectly ordinary, and nothing in his manner suggested that his mind was doing what it was actually doing, moving at speed through the past 3 years of working alongside Robert Cahill, checking every interaction against this new frame, feeling the nausea of seeing a familiar map differently. Cahill was 2 seats down. I was reviewing his notes for his section of the planning session presentation. He looked exactly the way he always looked. He had a coffee in front of him and a stylus in his hand, and the settled, unremarkable demeanor of a man who had no idea that the room around him had changed character entirely. The session resumed. Cahill presented his section at 14:20. It was competent, organized, thorough. Whitaker watched him present it and felt the specific vertigo of observing something familiar with the knowledge that his familiarity was the thing that had been weaponized, that the comfort of knowing someone, the certainty that you could read them, could be used against you as precisely as any other blind spot. He thought about Claire Morgan. I thought about 6 months of looking at someone and seeing only what he expected to see. He thought, that's what this is. That's exactly what this is. The planning session ended at 15:10. At 15:17, 3 men in civilian clothes arrived at the division's administrative entrance and presented credentials to the duty officer that resulted in an immediate call to Major Reyes. Reyes appeared in the corridor within 4 minutes. At 15:23, Robert Cahill was asked politely, and without scene, to accompany 2 of the men to a room in the administrative building that was not his own office, and was not explained to him in any detail before he entered it. He went without resistance. He went with the face of a man who did not yet know whether to be confused or afraid, and was hoping that confusion was the right answer. He would understand within approximately 12 minutes that it was not. At 15:31, the third man, who had stayed behind, knocked on the door of the Joint Evaluation Office and showed Claire his credentials. She looked at them carefully and handed them back. "How can I help you?" she said. "We're going to need to talk through your documentation methodology," he said. "Start to finish. Everything you observed and how you observed it." She had been expecting this. She had a second copy of the full documentation package ready on her desk. She handed it across without ceremony. "Start with page 11, she said. "The first instance is in the third paragraph. I've annotated the surrounding context." He looked at her for a moment. "You've done this before." "I've built documentation before," she said. "Not exactly this, but the methodology is the same." He sat down. They worked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. At 1:08, with the administrative building quiet around them. The investigator closed his own notebook and looked at her across the desk. "The question is going to come up," he said, "about why you sat on this for 2 weeks. "I know," she said. "People will say you should have moved faster. Some of them will be right," she said. "I made a judgment call about confirmation. I gave myself one more review cycle before I moved. In hindsight, 2 weeks was longer than necessary." She paused. "It was also not so long that any operational harm resulted. I've checked that." He studied her. "You already know the answer you're going to give when this comes up in debrief." "I know the true answer," she said, "which is the same thing." He closed his folder. "The 2-week window is going to matter less than the accuracy of the documentation. And the documentation is—" He paused. "It's thorough." "It's accurate," she said. "Thorough follows from accurate." He stood. He shook her hand. "We'll be in touch." He left. Claire sat in the office alone. Outside, the base was moving into evening. The sounds of it, familiar and continuous. The ordinary rhythm of 340 Marines doing the work that didn't stop because something had broken open in the middle of it. She could hear voices from the training field. The distant percussion of equipment being stowed, the particular energy of a day winding toward its close. She had not eaten since 06:30. She was not thinking about food. She was thinking about Robert Cahill in a room in the administrative building, and about the specific human fact of a man who had worked alongside people who trusted him and had chosen to become a different kind of person than they knew, and about what exactly produced that choice, whether it was a single moment of decision or a slow accumulation of smaller ones, whether he had recognized the point of no return when he crossed it, or only understood what he'd done when the distance between where he was and where he'd started became too large to pretend it was crossable. She was not excusing it. She was not interested in excusing it. She was interested in understanding it because understanding was the only thing that produced information that was actually useful, and useful information was the only thing that mattered in the territory she'd been operating in. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Brooks. It said, "Heard something happened in admin. You okay?" She looked at the message for a moment. Then she wrote back, "I'm fine. Tell you what I can when I can." His reply came in less than 10 seconds. "Good enough. Chow's open until 1900 if you need it." She almost smiled. She stood, gathered her materials, locked the office, and walked toward the chow hall, because Brooks was right, and she had not eaten, and the next chapter of this was going to require everything she had, and everything she had required fuel. The base moved around her. The evening settled, and beneath the ordinary surface of it, something that had been hidden for months. Inside the familiar walls of Camp Pendleton was being carefully, methodically, irrevocably brought into the light. The news about Cahill moved through the division, the way all significant news moved through a closed military community, not through official channels, not through announcement, but through the specific velocity of people who worked in close quarters and noticed absences and asked questions and connected answers to other answers until a shape emerged that nobody had officially described, but everyone had assembled independently. By Saturday morning, people knew something had happened. By Saturday afternoon, they knew it involved Cahill. By Saturday evening, the word investigation was in the air, and the specific silence that surrounded it, the careful, instinctive silence of men and women who understood that talking too much about an ongoing investigation was the fastest way to become part of it, had settled over the division like a weather system. What nobody knew yet was what the investigation was actually about. Whitaker knew, Reyes knew, Claire knew, and the three of them were carrying the weight of that knowledge through the division's ordinary weekend operations, with the particular discipline of people who understood that premature information was more dangerous than no information at all. Whitaker was the one carrying it hardest. He ran the Saturday morning PT session at 0600 with the same intensity and precision. He always ran it, and nobody watching him would have known that he'd been awake since 0230, running through 3 years of operational memory with the specific nauseating focus of a man trying to determine the full extent of his own blindness. Every exercise he'd planned with Cahill. Every planning session where Cahill had been present. Every offhand comment about upcoming rotations or training schedules that had happened in Cahill's earshot, because Cahill was simply always there, always reliable, always the background presence that Whitaker had long since stopped consciously registering. That was the thing that kept surfacing. He'd stopped consciously registering him. Familiarity as blindness. He'd learned that lesson 2 days ago on a training mat in front of 340 Marines, and here it was again, wearing a different face, in a place he couldn't have imagined looking for it. After PT, he found Claire. She was in the evaluation office with the door open, not performing openness, just not bothering to close what didn't need to be closed. He knocked on the frame anyway. She looked up. "How long did you know?" he said. She understood immediately what he was asking. "I identified the pattern 6 weeks ago. I confirmed it to my own satisfaction 2 weeks ago." Whitaker stepped into the office. He didn't sit. 2 weeks. Yes. And you didn't? He stopped. Controlled the direction the sentence was heading. You were waiting to be certain. I was waiting to be certain, she confirmed. And I was waiting to understand the right chain for the report. A mistake on either count would have compromised the case and potentially warned him. Whitaker stood very still. Was there any damage to operations? NCIS is mapping that now. Based on what I documented, the leaks were planning layer information timing, Windows rotation schedules, nothing that appears to have reached targeting data. But I'm not the one making that determination. He nodded slowly. He was processing. She watched him do it the particular way his jaw worked when he was holding something back and choosing words carefully, and she understood what was underneath the processing. It wasn't anger, or not primarily anger. It was the specific grief of a man who had trusted someone and discovered that the trust had been used as a tool against him and against the people he was responsible for. He ate at my table, Whitaker said. The sentence arrived without context or explanation and needed neither. Claire looked at him. Yes. 3 Thanksgivings. He shook his head slowly. My kids know his name. She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say that wasn't already understood between them, and she had learned long ago that filling silence with language, when silence was doing necessary work, was a form of avoidance disguised as comfort. He stood in that silence for a moment. Then he said, I want to address the formation, about what's happening, as much as I'm cleared to say. Reyes will need to approve the content. I know. I'm going to her after this. He paused. I wanted to tell you first. She looked at him steadily. Why? Because you saw this before I did, and you carried it correctly, and I want you to know that I understand that. He held her gaze. And because when I stand in front of those Marines, I want to say something true. I need to make sure the thing I'm planning to say is actually true. What are you planning to say? I was quiet for a moment. That what happened with Cahill, with the way this division has treated joint personnel, with the jokes and the assumptions and all of it, that none of it happened in a vacuum. That cultures either protect people or they don't, and a culture that doesn't protect everyone equally creates the conditions for all kinds of failure, not just the ones that look small. Claire looked at him for a long time. That's true, she said. Then I'll say it. He left to find Reyes. She sat alone in the office and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, something that was not quite relief and not quite vindication, and was closest to the particular quality of recognition that arrives when the thing you have been working toward for a long time becomes visible as something real rather than something intended. She had not come here for this outcome. She had not designed this outcome. She had done a job, and the job had revealed what was underneath the surface of the thing she was assessing, and the thing underneath was going to require everything she and everyone around her had in order to address it honestly. That was not a comfortable situation. It was the right one. The formation. Whitaker called for Sunday morning was not on the training schedule. He put the word out through Brooks at 0730 Full Division Assembly, Main Field, 0900, attendance mandatory for all active joint personnel, and the word moved through the division in the way his words always moved, with the particular authority of someone whose instructions had never needed to be repeated. By 0850, 340 Marines and all 12 joint assignment personnel were assembled. They knew something significant was coming. The presence of Major Reyes at the side of the field, standing rather than seated in full uniform, watching the formation with the focused attention of a commanding officer who was not here as an observer, told them the weight of it before anyone said a word. Claire stood near the back of the joint personnel cluster, not hiding, not performing, just in her place. Whitaker walked to the front of the formation. Howe was not carrying notes. He never carried notes. It was a point of professional pride, the belief that if you needed to read what you were saying to the people you were responsible for, you hadn't thought hard enough about what you were actually trying to say. But this morning, the absence of notes meant something different. It meant he'd been over this enough times in enough different forms that the words had settled into their final shape on their own. He looked at the formation. He said, "What I'm about to tell you is going to be uncomfortable. I want to start by saying that uncomfortable is appropriate. If this goes down easy, I haven't said it right." 340 Marines adjusted their collective attention by approximately 1 degree. It was not a physical movement. It was a quality of attention shift that anyone who had spent time with large groups of people would recognize the subtle auditory and muscular signal of a population, deciding that what was being said was worth the effort of fully receiving. "You've heard something happened Friday," Whitaker said. "You don't know all of it. What I can tell you at the level I'm cleared to speak is that a member of this division was placed under federal investigation for the unauthorized disclosure of operational planning information." He paused. "That investigation is ongoing. The individual has been removed from the division. I'm not going to say his name because the investigation is ongoing, and he has rights under that process that I am not going to compromise by making this a trial in a field." Nobody moved. "What I am going to do," Whitaker continued, "is tell you what I know about how this happened. Not the details of the act itself, the conditions that made it possible." He paused. Let the silence work. "For the past several months, this division has hosted a joint evaluation. You all know Lieutenant Morgan. You've known her for 6 months. Most of you know her primarily through the ways I characterized her, the jokes I made, the assumptions I stated out loud in front of you repeatedly." He said it without hedging, without the softening language of someone trying to manage their own culpability. Those characterizations were wrong. They were wrong because they were made without information, and I repeated them so consistently that they became the default operating assumption of this formation, without anyone, including me, stopping to examine whether they were true. A corporal in the 3rd row. Young recently assigned someone who'd arrived at Pendleton 4 months ago and had absorbed the existing culture. The way everyone absorbed existing culture by ambient exposure, felt something shift in his chest. He couldn't have named it precisely. It was the sensation of something he'd accepted as given being lifted and shown to him as a choice. The distinction was uncomfortable in a productive way. That kind of assumption, the unexamined repeated kind, creates a culture, Whitaker said. And the culture this division operated in for the past 6 months treated joint personnel as a category rather than as individuals. The consequence of that was that 3 people in this formation were functionally marginalized for the duration of their assignment here, and their observations and concerns were not heard with the weight they deserved. He looked across the formation. "I am responsible for that. Reyes and I are working on a command climate review that will address it structurally. But the structural address doesn't remove individual responsibility, and I want to be clear about that." He paused again. "The connection to the investigation," he said, "is this. A culture that doesn't see everyone clearly doesn't see anything clearly. When we decide we already know who someone is, we stop looking. And when we stop looking, we miss things. We miss them in our assessments of people we dismiss. We miss them in our assessments of people we trust. Both failures come from the same source." He looked across the field. "I missed things. I'm going to spend a significant amount of time understanding what I missed and why and how I'm going to run this division differently. I owe that to every person standing in front of me." The formation was completely still. In the back cluster, Brooks stood with his eyes fixed on Whitaker and felt something that he did not have an immediate word for, and later trying to explain it to Gutierrez, described only as watching someone tell the exact truth when it costs them something. Gutierrez had said, "Is that rare?" Brooks had said, "You have no idea." Whitaker looked at the joint personnel cluster. He looked at Claire. He said, "Lieutenant Morgan, thank you for doing your job." He said it the way he would have said it to any Marine who had performed with distinction under difficult circumstances, directly, without sentiment, without performance. The thanks of a professional to a professional. Claire met his gaze. She nodded once. He turned back to the full formation. "That's what I have. Questions go through your NCOs. Dismissed." The formation broke, and the sound of 340 people dispersing had a different quality than it usually had, not louder, not more energetic, but more present, somehow more conscious of itself, as if the collection of individuals that made up the division had briefly, and somewhat uncomfortably, become aware of itself as a collection. Specialist Angela Tran found Claire at the edge of the field 20 minutes after the formation dispersed. Tran was 26. She'd been in the Army for 4 years, had a mechanical engineering background that she applied to logistics systems, with the particular precision of someone who found genuine pleasure in making complicated things work efficiently. She was 5'3" and built solidly, and had a quality of self-containment that Claire had recognized immediately 6 months ago as something she knew from the inside. She stopped beside Claire without preamble. She said, "The planning correction I ran on Thursday, the one Whitaker mentioned." Claire waited. "I've known how to run that sequence for 8 months, Tran said. "I ran it once in September in a small group session. Nobody acknowledged it, so I stopped." She paused. "I stopped offering things, and nobody noticed I'd stopped, which told me everything I needed to know about whether I should start again." Claire looked at her directly. And now Whitaker mentioned it in a formation debrief," Tran said. "Which means someone noticed. Which means—" She stopped. She looked at the field. "I don't know what it means for here. I have 4 months left on this rotation, but after this rotation—" She looked back at Claire. "I'm putting in for the Advanced Systems Integration course. I've been sitting on the application for 3 months." "Send it," Claire said. "I'm going to." Tran paused. "I just wanted you to know. The evaluation, whatever it found, it wasn't just numbers, for me." She looked at Claire steadily. "Someone paid attention. That matters." She walked away before Claire could respond. Claire stood where she was for a moment. Then she walked to the evaluation office and sat down and opened her working file and began writing. Not the formal evaluation document, but the section she'd been trying to find the right language for since the beginning of the assignment, the section about what cultural assessment actually measured and why the numbers were always the last thing to move. She wrote, "Institutional culture is measured most accurately not in what it produces, but in what it prevents. The capability that never gets expressed. The correction that doesn't get offered. The application that sits in a drawer for 3 months. By the time degradation is visible in output metrics, the source of it has been operating for years. The intervention point is not the metric. The intervention point is the moment a person decides whether to offer what they have." She read it back. She kept it. It was the truest thing she'd written in the whole document. At 100, Reyes called her into the command office. Reyes was behind her desk. Across from her in the visitor's chair was a man Claire had not seen before, mid-50s civilian clothes that that carried the particular nondescript quality of someone accustomed to not being remembered, with the kind of face that was experienced rather than aged. He stood when Claire entered. "Lieutenant Morgan, I'm Frank Alderman." He extended his hand. "NCIS." She shook it. "The investigation. Adjacent to it." He gestured to the second visitor's chair. She sat. "I've reviewed your documentation. My colleagues have been working through the specifics of the Cahill situation. But I'm here about something related to the methodology question." Claire looked at Reyes, then back at Alderman. "The 2-week window. Among other things." He sat. "The documentation is meticulous. Your chain was correct. Your confirmation standard was high, and your reasoning for the delay is defensible." He paused. "What I want to understand is the broader picture. You were conducting a cultural assessment. At some point, the cultural assessment intersected with something operational. Walk me through when you recognized the intersection and how you navigated the 2 tracks simultaneously." It was a genuine question. Not a challenge, a request for information from someone who would use it to understand something. She told him. All of it in the same measured, precise way she'd told the first investigator. The moment of recognition. The 4 review cycles. The decision framework. The call to OSE. The 72-hour window. When she finished, Alderman sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "The cultural findings and the operational finding, you maintain them as separate tracks." "They are separate," she said. "Causally related, but separate. The cultural environment created conditions that made the operational failure easier to sustain. But the cultural problem would exist without Cahill, and Cahill's actions would have been a problem regardless of the cultural environment. Some people," Alderman said carefully, "are going to look at this and suggest that the cultural findings are being used to explain or contextualize the operational failure in a way that distributes responsibility more broadly than it belongs." "Some people will be wrong," Claire said. "And the documentation supports that they're wrong." He almost smiled. "I know. I've read it." He closed his notebook. "One more question, and it's not about the documentation." He looked at her. "Cahill's been in this division 3 years. In a culture that, as you've documented extensively, had a consistent pattern of dismissing people, it hadn't admitted to full standing. Cahill had full standing. He was trusted, included, integrated." He paused. "Did it occur to you that the same culture that marginalized Tran and Price and Webb also created the conditions where Cahill felt whatever he felt that led him here?" The question landed in the room with its full weight. Claire looked at him steadily. She had thought about this. She had thought about it at 02:30 on Saturday morning when sleep had abandoned her, and she'd been sitting with the full picture of what she'd built and what it meant. She had thought about it with the particular honesty she tried to apply to things she didn't want to think about. "Yes," she said, "it occurred to me. And I don't know enough about his specific motivation to confirm or refute it. That's your work, not mine." She paused. "What I can say is that a culture which creates strong in-groups and clear out-groups produces consequences in both directions. People in the out-group are diminished. People in the in-group are given a kind of untouchability that is its own distortion." She met his eyes. "Whitaker didn't examine Cahill because Cahill was inside the circle of trust. That's documented. What Cahill chose to do with that trust is a separate moral question that I'm not qualified to adjudicate." Alderman looked at her for a long moment. "You should consider federal investigative work," he said. Seriously. "I'll add it to the list," she said. He left. Reyes sat across from her in the silence that followed. She was looking at Claire with the expression she got when she was assessing something that she'd already assessed and was checking her assessment against new information. "How are you holding up?" Reyes said. The question surprised Claire, not because it wasn't welcome, but because Reyes was not a person who asked questions she didn't mean, and the directness of it landed differently than the same question would have from someone asking it as pleasantry. "I'm functional," Claire said. "That's not what I asked." Claire looked at her. Then, because honesty was the only currency that had ever worked in any relationship that mattered to her. I'm tired. I've been carrying a lot of separate things in separate compartments for a long time, and the compartments have been useful, but they have a cost. Reyes nodded. They do. I'm managing it. I know you are. Reyes looked at her directly. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to receive it as information rather than sentiment. She paused. What you've done in this assignment, the evaluation, the parallel track, the way you held it all together while Whitaker was making your daily existence actively hostile, that's not what the assignment asked for. The assignment asked for a readiness assessment. You gave it a readiness assessment, an organizational pathology analysis, a documented operational security failure, and a cultural intervention that is going to change how this division operates for years. She paused. That's not normal. The situation wasn't normal, Claire said. No, Reyes agreed. But a lot of people in abnormal situations produce normal output because they're managing their energy and protecting themselves. You didn't. She paused. I want to make sure you understand that I see that. Claire felt something move behind her sternum, the specific, slightly uncomfortable warmth of being accurately seen by someone whose assessment you respected. Thank you, she said, and meant it. Brooks found her at 1500, near the equipment bay she'd started to think of as their conversation space. The places where the important things happened were never the official ones. He fell into step beside her. Transcending her application, he said. I know. Price told me this morning that she put in a request to be considered for the Advanced Squad Leader course. Whitaker signed it before she finished asking. He paused. 3 months ago, she would have assumed the answer was no before she asked. 3 months ago, she would have been right to assume that, Claire said. Yeah. He walked beside her in silence for a moment. What happens now with you? With the evaluation? The formal report goes up the chain in approximately 3 weeks. Reyes gets it first, then it moves. She paused. The investigation runs its course separately. And after, I go back to my next assignment. Brooks stopped walking. She took 2 more steps and then stopped and turned to look at him. Howe was looking at her with the particular expression she'd come to recognize as his version of something important being processed. He was not a man who processed things quickly in the conversational sense. He took time. He let things settle, and when he spoke, it was because the thing had finished settling and he knew what he actually thought. You know what happened here, he said. Not the investigation, not the report, here. He gestured generally at the space around them, the base, the division, the 340 people who'd started a week one way and were ending it differently. You know what actually happened. Tell me what you think happened, she said. He looked at the middle distance. 340 people had to examine something they'd been comfortable not examining. Most of them are going to keep doing that examination after you're gone, because once you start doing it, you can't fully stop. He paused. Whitaker's going to be a better instructor, not a different instructor, a better one, because he knows something now about his own blind spots that he didn't know before. Another pause. Tran's going to send that application. Price is going to get that course. And some corporal who's been on the edge of deciding whether it's worth offering what he actually has is going to decide that it is. He looked at her. You did that. The situation did that, she said. You were the situation, he said flatly. Stop distributing your own credit. She looked at him. He shook his head slightly. You know what your problem is. The same thing that makes you good at what you do. You've spent so long being the person who doesn't need acknowledgement that you've made it a principle instead of a strategy. He met her eyes. It was a good strategy when you needed it. You don't need it as much now. She held his gaze for a long moment. I'll work on it, she said. He nodded. Good. He resumed walking. Chow's in an hour. You're eating this time. I ate yesterday. You ate at 1900 after working 16 hours. That's not eating, that's fueling emergency operations. He didn't look back. 1 hour. She watched him go. Then she almost, not quite, but almost smiled. She turned and walked back toward the evaluation office. She had 3 weeks of work left. The formal report would not write itself and would not be right on the first draft, and would need the same quality of attention that everything else in this assignment had needed. She would not shortchange it because the dramatic part was over. The dramatic part being over didn't mean the work was. She sat at her desk and opened the file and began. Outside the base continued its Saturday operations. The training, the maintenance, the 1,000 ordinary tasks that made up the daily existence of a military installation. Inside those ordinary operations, something had fractured open and was being examined piece by people who were not entirely comfortable with the examination, but were choosing to continue it anyway. That was the work, not the dramatic moment. Not the takedown on the mat, or the investigator in the room, or the formation speech, or any single visible event. The work was the continued choosing every day by every person to see more clearly than they had the day before. Claire Morgan knew better than almost anyone how hard that choosing was. She also knew it was the only thing that ever actually changed anything. She wrote the next section of the report, and outside her window, without announcement, without any particular ceremony, Camp Pendleton's training division continued the slow and necessary work of becoming something better than it had been. The formal evaluation report landed on Major Reyes's desk on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after the training mat demonstration that had started everything. It was 93 pages. Reyes read it in one sitting, which took 4 hours and 20 minutes, with the door closed and her phone forwarded and a cold cup of coffee that she'd forgotten to drink sitting at the corner of her desk. When she finished, she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Commander Osei in Virginia. The call lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, Reyes put the phone down and looked at the report again, not reading it, just looking at it, the way you look at something you need to carry and are measuring against your own strength before you pick it up. Then she picked up her pen and signed the transmittal sheet. The report went up the chain that afternoon. Claire didn't know the exact moment it moved. She was in the secondary training bay at the time running her Duro 530 conditioning sequence, 3 hours late, because the final draft had kept her at her desk until Duro 200, and she'd slept through her alarm for the first time in 4 years. She discovered she wasn't particularly troubled by this. 4 years of perfect 0530 alarms felt like a fair trade for 93 pages of work that said exactly what it needed to say. She finished her sequence and went to the chow hall. Brooks was there. He looked up when she came in, assessed the slightly late, slightly rumpled quality of her appearance, and said nothing, which was the correct response. He slid a full coffee mug across the table when she sat down. She wrapped both hands around it. "It went up," he said. "This morning." He nodded. He let a moment pass. "How does it feel?" She considered the question the way she considered all questions actually, rather than reflexively. "Like putting something down that I've been carrying for a long time," she said. "And then immediately wondering what I'm supposed to do with my hands." Brooks almost laughed. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said in front of food." "I'm tired," she said. "Tired people tell the truth more easily. Good to know." He wrapped his own hands around his mug. "Whitaker wants to talk to you. He's been trying to find the right moment for 3 days." "I know," she said. "I've been letting him find it." "Why?" "Because whatever he needs to say it when he's ready to say it, not when I've made it convenient." She paused. Some conversations require the discomfort of the timing. Brooks looked at her. "You know you're kind of exhausting, right?" "I've been told." "By who?" "Everyone who's ever worked closely with me." He nodded slowly. "Fair. Coffee's hot. Eat something real." She ate something real. Whitaker found her at 1100 in the evaluation office, which was in the process of being partially disassembled. She'd begun returning materials to the administrative stores, consolidating the 6 months of working files into the archival format required by the transmittal protocol. The office was not empty, but it had the quality of a space that was preparing to be. He stood in the doorway and looked at the half-packed shelves and the consolidated files, and then at her. "You're already closing it down," he said. "The formal report moved this morning. The operational phase of the evaluation is complete." She set a folder in a box. "I have 2 weeks remaining on the attachment order. Administrative wrap-up debrief with Reyes final coordination on the NCIS parallel track. He stepped inside. And then, new assignment. She didn't elaborate because the details weren't his to have, and he understood this without requiring explanation. He sat in the chair across from her desk. The one Reyes had occupied, the one Alderman had occupied the chair that had held most of the significant conversations of the past 2 weeks. He sat in it with the posture of a man who was not comfortable and had decided not to pretend he was. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you," he started. Brooks mentioned. 3 days, he said. "I've been over it 3 days, and I still don't have it exactly right." He looked at her. "I'm going to say it imperfectly, and I need you to hear the intention underneath the imperfection." She put down the folder she was holding. She gave him her full attention. "All right. What I did for 6 months, the jokes, the dismissals, all of it, I knew it was wrong even when I was doing it." He said it straight without hedging. "Not every time. Sometimes I genuinely thought it was harmless, but other times I knew it wasn't harmless, and I did it anyway because it was easy, and because nobody was stopping me, and because I decided somewhere without examining the decision that you were a category of person rather than a specific person." He paused. "That's the part I can't make comfortable, and I don't think I should. There were moments where I had enough information to stop, and I didn't stop." The room was quiet. "I've been trying to figure out whether to apologize to you or thank you," he continued. "And I've realized that that's the wrong frame, because apologizing and thanking are both things I'm doing for myself to resolve something in me. What I actually owe you is something different." He looked at her directly. "I owe you the acknowledgement that you came into this division and did a job that required you to absorb 6 months of deliberate diminishment from the senior person in the room, and you did it without sacrificing the quality of the work or the integrity of the methodology. And the result is that this division is going to be materially better than it was. And those are connected things. The way you responded to the diminishment and the quality of the output are not separate." He held her gaze. "I made your job harder than it needed to be. The work survived anyway. That's not a coincidence." Claire looked at him for a long moment. She had prepared without fully acknowledging to herself that she was preparing for several versions of this conversation. She'd prepared for the version where Whitaker apologized performatively. She'd prepared for the version where he defended himself while appearing not to. She'd prepared for the version where he was genuine but unable to land on the specific truth of it. She had not fully prepared for this, for the version where a man who had been wrong for 6 months looked at her and named exactly how he had been wrong and what it had cost and offered no cover story. It disarmed her in a way she hadn't expected. She said, "You were also right." He blinked. "What?" "You were right about the things you were right about," she said. "You're a genuinely good instructor. The technical capability you've built in this division is real, and it's significant, and it's because of your work over 3 years. The report reflects that." She paused. "The things you got wrong don't cancel what you got right. I want to be accurate about that." He looked at her with the expression of someone who had come prepared to accept a verdict and has been given something more complicated than a verdict. "That's generous," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "I'm not generous, I'm precise." Something crossed his face that was close to the thing she'd seen when she told him training was complete on the mat, that specific combination of recognition and discomfort that arrives when a truth lands with more weight than you were braced for. "All right," he said. He paused. "I want to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly." "I answer everything honestly," she said. "I know, that's why I'm asking." He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. "The morning on the mat. When you stepped on it, when you made the decision to step on it, were you angry at me?" She considered the question carefully. It deserved that. "No," she said. "Not at all. Not at you specifically. I was frustrated with the situation. I was tired of the cost of maintaining patience in a situation that kept escalating. And when you pointed at me in front of 340 people, I made a calculation, a real-time calculation about whether I was willing to let that moment define the rest of the assignment." She paused. The calculation took about 4 seconds. The answer was no. 4 seconds, he said. "The answer was already in me," she said. The 4 seconds was just confirmation. I was quiet for a long moment. Then, you know what hit me the hardest? Not the takedown. Not even the training complete. He shook his head slightly. It was that you stepped back afterward. You took one step back and you just waited. No satisfaction. Nothing. He looked at her. I've been in a lot of physical confrontations in my life, competitive and otherwise. I have never once been able to do that. Win something and not let it show. It wasn't a win, she said. It was a demonstration. Those are different things. Not to the 340 people watching. Especially to them, she said. If I'd performed satisfaction, they would have remembered the satisfaction. They would have walked away talking about the moment of reversal. Instead, she paused. Instead, they walked away thinking about what it meant, about what my restraint meant, about what the whole thing actually said. She met his eyes. The lesson I needed them to receive required them to do the interpretation themselves. Satisfaction would have done it for them, and it would have landed half as deep. Whitaker sat with that for a long moment. You were teaching, he said. I was always teaching, she said. That's what the assignment was. The Command Climate Review delivered its preliminary findings to Reyes on Thursday morning, 2 days after the report went up the chain and 6 days before Claire's attachment order ended. The findings were not entirely comfortable. They were not supposed to be. They named specific patterns, specific failures of oversight, specific places where the division's informal culture had produced outcomes inconsistent with its formal standards. They also named specific strengths because honest assessment went in both directions. Reyes called a division-wide meeting to present the preliminary findings in summary form. She stood at the front of the briefing room with all available personnel, Marines Joint Attachments administrative staff, and she presented the findings, the way she presented everything directly, without softening, without the bureaucratic padding that turned difficult truths into palatable abstractions. She said, the review found that this division has consistently high technical capability and consistently uneven integration of non-organic personnel. Those two things coexist because high technical capability is visible and measurable and gets corrected quickly when it fails. Integration failures are invisible and unmeasurable in the short term and therefore go uncorrected until they compound. She looked across the room. The review also found that the leadership culture in this division, and I include myself in this, had developed a tolerance for informal exclusion that we coded as harmless because it never produced a visible crisis. It was not harmless. The evaluation currently being processed by command documents the harm in specific measurable terms. Nobody said anything. The corrective actions begin next week, she said. I'll distribute the formal implementation plan through your NCOs. What I want to say before I do that is this. She paused. The people in this room who were the subjects of the informal exclusion documented in the evaluation did not cause the culture that excluded them. They operated inside it at personal cost, and the fact that most of them continued to perform at a high level while operating at that cost is not evidence that the cost was acceptable. It is evidence of their capability. Those are different things. She looked at the Joint Personnel section. I want to be clear that this command sees the difference. Specialist Tran sat in the second row and felt something she had stopped expecting to feel inside a military environment, the specific, almost physical sensation of being actually counted. It was such an ordinary thing. Being counted. Knowing that your presence and your absence from a room would produce different outcomes. Most people probably felt it most of the time, and didn't think about it the way you didn't think about the floor being solid until you stepped somewhere and it wasn't. She had spent 5 months at Camp Pendleton not being counted, and she had managed it, and she had continued performing, and she had told herself that managing it and continuing to perform was enough because it was the thing she could control. She understood now that managing it was not enough. It was not enough because she deserved better than managing it, and because the cost of managing it, the application that sat in a drawer, the correction sequence. She stopped offering the accumulation of small withheld capabilities was a cost to the mission, not just a cost to her. After the meeting, she went back to her workstation and opened the Advanced Systems Integration course application. She'd already submitted and read it again, not to change it, just to confirm that it was real, that she'd actually sent it, that the thing that had felt impossible 3 months ago was now a document in a pipeline moving toward a decision. It was real. She closed the application and went back to work. 4 days before her attachment order ended, something happened that Claire had not anticipated. She was called to the command office at 0900, not by Reyes, but by a notification from the Joint Command Liaison Desk that a message had been forwarded to her through official channels from Naval Special Warfare Command. The message was brief and did not explain itself, which was the custom for this particular category of communication. It requested her availability for a video conference at 1400. The conference was with 2 people, Commander Osei, who was not a surprise, and a Rear Admiral named James Castillo, who was. Castillo ran the Joint Operational Readiness Division within NAV SpecWar. He was 60 years old and had the quality of attention of someone who had been doing consequential work long enough to develop the specific skill of making the person he was looking at feel that they were the only thing in the room worth looking at. He looked at Claire through the screen for a moment before speaking. "Lieutenant Morgan," he said, "I've read the evaluation report." "Yes, sir?" "All 93 pages." "I'm aware of the page count, sir." The edge of something moved across his face. "The command climate findings will be processed through the standard review and response protocol. That's underway." He paused. "What I want to talk to you about is the secondary track, the operational security finding. The NCIS investigation is ongoing," she said carefully. "I'm aware of that. I've been briefed." He looked at her steadily. "What I want to understand from you, not from the documentation, not from the investigators from you, is how you held those 2 tracks simultaneously without allowing one to contaminate the other." It was not the question she'd expected. She'd expected procedural questions, confirmation questions, the administrative territory of a superior officer managing a significant finding in his operational space. He was asking something more fundamental. "I kept them separate because they had to be separate," she said. "The cultural findings required observable evidence of systemic patterns over time. The operational finding required forensic documentation of specific acts. Different methodologies, different chains, different standards of evidence." She paused. "If I'd combined them, both would have been compromised. The cultural findings would have looked like cover for the operational accusation. The operational documentation would have looked like a product of a biased cultural assessment. And the personal dimension," Castillo said. "You were being actively marginalized by the senior instructor in the division. Simultaneously, you discovered that another member of the division was committing what may be a federal offense. Did the personal dimension affect either track?" She thought about this honestly. "I can't claim perfect insulation," she said. "The personal dimension made the cultural track more vivid. I have direct experience of the culture I was documenting, which gave me granular access to the mechanisms of it that a purely external observer wouldn't have." She paused. Whether that access made the findings more accurate or introduced bias is something the peer review process will determine. What I can say is that I built in review cycles specifically because I was aware of my own position inside the subject matter. Castillo studied her. "The 4 review cycles on the operational track?" "Yes, sir." "Most people in your position would have moved at cycle 2. "Most people in my position would have moved correctly at cycle 2, she said. "I wasn't certain until cycle 4. I won't move on something like that before I'm certain." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a program, NAV SpecWar Joint Assessment. We're building a permanent team whose function is exactly what you've been doing here. Cultural evaluation in high-stakes operational environments. Finding what's underneath the numbers before it becomes a crisis." He looked at her. "We're at the point of selecting the team lead." Claire looked at him steadily. "I'm in the middle of an attachment order," she said, "which ends in 4 days." She said nothing. "I'm not making an offer in this conversation," he said. "I'm indicating a direction. The formal conversation happens through proper channels after your debrief. But I wanted to tell you myself directly, because the kind of work you've done here deserves to be spoken to directly." He paused. You've been doing your job in a place that made your job harder than it should have been. What you produced anyway is what I need from a team lead. That's not a compliment. It's an assessment. I understand the difference, she said. I know you do. He glanced at Osei. Commander. Osei took the screen. Think about it, she said. I will, Claire said. The call ended. She sat in the command office alone for a few minutes. The building was quiet around her, the particular mid-morning quiet of an operational installation between cycles. Through the window she couldn't see anything interesting, and she wasn't looking at the window anyway. She was looking at the space in front of her, which was not really a space, but the internal territory of a decision that had not yet been formally offered, and was already fully formed in her. She knew what her answer was. She'd known it before the call ended. She stood up and went back to work. The last 3 days moved quickly. The way the end of long assignments always moved the pace of daily operations unchanged, but the texture of it different, each interaction, carrying the slight additional weight of something that is happening for the final time without announcing itself as such. Brooks found her. Thursday evening, in what had become by unspoken agreement, their regular end-of-day conversation spot, the secondary training bay. The place where he'd come to find her on the day after the mat, where the important words had happened before either of them fully understood what they were building. Howe was already there when she arrived, which was unusual. He was not typically a person who arrived before the thing was scheduled to begin. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and the specific look of someone who has had a conversation with himself and has been waiting to have the follow-up conversation with someone else. I heard from Gutierrez, he said, about Castillo's call. How did Gutierrez hear? Gutierrez hears everything. Nobody knows how. He looked at her. Team lead. Possibly. You already know what you're going to say. Possibly. He gave her the look he gave her when she was being precise in a way that was a form of deflection. She acknowledged it with a slight tilt of her head. Yes, she said. I know what I'm going to say. He nodded once. Good. He paused. Tran got her application through. Preliminary acceptance to the Advanced Systems Integration course. She found out this morning. Claire felt something warm and specific move through her chest. Tell me she's going, she said. She's going. He smiled, not the almost smile he usually gave her, but an actual complete smile that had nothing managed about it. She came and found me to tell me. I don't know why she told me I had nothing to do with it. You had something to do with it, Claire said. You noticed what I noticed, and you said what you said, and that contributed to an environment where she felt like sending the application was worth trying. She paused. People don't become willing to try in a vacuum. He looked at her for a moment. You know what you just did? What? You just accepted that your presence in a situation produced a positive outcome that would not have occurred without you. He raised an eyebrow. You usually deflect that back to the situation. She considered this. Maybe I'm learning. Maybe, he said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to put you in for a commendation before you leave. Through Whitaker's signature, he already agreed. She opened her mouth. Don't, he said before she could speak. Don't tell me it's not necessary. Don't tell me the work is the point and recognition is incidental. I know that's what you believe, and I know that's part of what makes you good at what you do. He met her eyes. But a formal record of what you did here matters for reasons that go beyond you personally. It matters for the next person who comes into a place like this and is told implicitly or explicitly that they don't belong. There should be a record that someone who looked like that and was treated like that did work like this. He paused. That record matters. She looked at him for a long time. All right, she said. He nodded. Friday. I'll have Whitaker sign off Thursday night. Friday morning, her last full day. She ran her 0530 conditioning sequence. She showered. She went to the chow hall and ate a full breakfast without needing to be told to, which felt like something. She walked to the evaluation office, which was now fully disassembled, the files archived. The working surface cleared, and sat for a moment in the empty space of it. 6 months. 93 pages. 1 mat. 1 investigation. 3 people who would carry better opportunities out of this assignment than they'd carried in. One division that was imperfectly and incompletely, and with the full human messiness of genuine institutional change, becoming something different. She had not come here to do any of this. She had come here to assess joint combat readiness, file a report, and move to the next assignment. She had done exactly that. Everything else had been the natural consequence of doing it honestly. At 0900, Reyes called the final Joint Personnel Assembly. Formal end of attachment remarks. The administrative language of concluded assignments. Claire stood in the formation with the other joint personnel and received the standard remarks and the standard handshakes and the standard notation in her service record. Then Whitaker stepped forward. He was holding a commendation folder. High had written the commendation himself. Brooks had edited it. Reyes had signed it alongside Whitaker's signature, which was unusual. Dual signature commendations happened, but they were not routine, and the fact of both signatures told everyone in the formation something about the weight of what was being documented before he read a word of it. He read it clearly without ceremony, the way he read everything, because ceremony was for things that needed elevation, and the content of this particular document elevated itself. He read, Lieutenant Claire Morgan demonstrated sustained excellence in joint evaluation methodology under conditions specifically designed to undermine the credibility of her assessment. Her work produced findings that will materially alter operational culture in this division for years. Her parallel identification and documentation of an operational security failure prevented compounding harm and exemplified the integration of analytical rigor with operational judgment. He paused. Her conduct throughout this assignment, including during periods of sustained institutional hostility for which this command bears direct responsibility, reflected the highest standards of professional integrity. He lowered the folder. He looked at her. The formation was still. He said, not for the record, not for this documentation, just one person to another. Thank you for not walking away. Claire received it. She did not deflect it. She did not redirect it to the situation or the methodology or the institutional forces at play. She received it the way Brooks had told her to receive things, as a person who had earned it and was willing finally to stand in that earning without apology. You're welcome, she said. And it was enough. She drove off base at 17:30 on Friday evening. 2 miles from the gate she pulled over. She did not know entirely why she pulled over. There was nothing wrong with the car, and no call she needed to make, and no document she'd forgotten. She simply stopped. She sat in the quiet for a moment. She thought about her father standing at the kitchen table with his damaged hand flat on the wood. She thought about what he'd said about the ocean, and about the 14 months of failing and trying again, and about the Euro 530 alarm she'd slept through for the first time in 4 years, and discovered she didn't need to have been perfect about. She thought about a training mat in the morning gray of a California winter and 340 people who had come expecting one story and received a different one. She thought about Tron's application, about Price's course request, about a 23-year-old corporal who had said, "That was wrong," in a storage room to a staff sergeant who outranked him and been answered honestly. She thought about Brooks, who had come to find her in a secondary training bay the day after the demonstration, and said what he should have said 6 months earlier, and then without waiting for absolution, started doing the work differently. She thought about Ryan Whitaker standing in front of 340 Marines and saying the exact truth when it cost him something. She thought about Castillo's call and the question she would answer formally in the coming days, and the team she would build, and the next place she would go, and the next institution that needed someone willing to look at the thing underneath the surface until the surface stopped being the only story. She had not come to Camp Pendleton to change anything. She had come to see clearly, report accurately, and hold the standard, not because she was certain it would matter, but because holding the standard was what she was, and you could not separate what you were from what you did, no matter how hard the environment around you made it. And that, in the end, was the thing nobody had laughed at. Not the quiet, not the stillness, not the restraint on the mat, or the 41 pages, or the 93 that followed. The thing nobody had ever been able to make into a joke, no matter how many mornings they'd tried, was the simple, unassailable fact of a person who knew exactly who she was. That was not a lesson that could be demonstrated on a mat, or written into a report, or contained in any commendation folder. It was something you either had, or you spent your whole life trying to find. Claire Morgan had found it in a kitchen in Maine at 11 years old, watching her father put his hand flat on a table and refuse to apologize to it. She had never once put it down. She pulled back onto the road and drove.